The coffee at Blackwell Capital smelled like burnt ambition and overtime, and I'd learned to drink it anyway. My desk sat just outside Nathaniel Blackwell's corner office on the 31st floor, close enough that I could hear when he exhaled too sharply during a call, which meant the Vancouver deal was falling apart again. And far enough that junior analysts assumed I didn't catch everything they whispered near the elevator. They were wrong about that too. 26 months. That was how long I'd worked for him. Long enough to know. He took his coffee black with exactly 1 sugar, that he ran his hand through his hair, when he was irritated versus when he was thinking, and that those 2 things looked almost identical until you'd watched him long enough to see the difference. Long enough to have stopped flinching when his voice went flat and cold across a boardroom, because I knew it meant he'd already won, and was just waiting for the other party to realize it. My name is Violet. No, wait. That's in the list. My name is Josephine. Everyone calls me Jo. I'd introduced myself that way the first day, nervous. My blazer slightly too big, because I'd bought it in a rush after getting the offer, and Nathaniel Blackwell had looked at me for exactly 3 seconds and said, "Fine, Romano," and then I'd had to stop him. "It's Callahan, actually. Josephine Callahan." He'd glanced at the resume on his desk, then back at me. "Right, Callahan, you'll do." That was it. That was my welcome. I'd gone home that night and told my roommate Blythe that I'd either quit within a week or stay for years. Blythe had poured us both wine and said, "Knowing you, it'll be years." She wasn't wrong. Nathaniel Blackwell ran a private equity firm that operated at the intersection of venture capital and old money. The kind of old money that didn't advertise, didn't need to, because everyone in Bay Street circles already knew the name. He was 38. Methodical in the way that people who'd survived real professional failure tended to be, and he had a reputation for being exactly as difficult, as the results he delivered were exceptional. Associates lasted an average of 7 months. I was the longest-running executive assistant he'd had in 4 years. I managed his calendar, his correspondence, his travel, his charitable commitments, the ones he'd never discuss but always honored, and occasionally, the specific silence required when something went wrong with a deal, and he needed 45 minutes alone before he could speak to anyone again. I'd learned to read that, too. He was not the kind of man people called warm, but he was the kind of man who, when he noticed you doing something right, would restructure your entire workflow around your strengths without mentioning that he'd noticed. I'd discovered this 6 months in, when I realized my daily briefing time had quietly shifted to 7:15 a.m., because he'd observed, without commenting, that I processed information better before the floor got loud. It wasn't warmth, but it was attention, and somewhere in 26 months, I'd started to wonder if, for him, they were the same thing. The day the flowers arrived, I was reconciling his travel expenses from the Calgary trip and arguing silently with a receipt from a hotel bar that didn't match the timeline of his itinerary. "Callahan." His voice came through the intercom with a particular cadence that meant he wanted something and already knew I'd anticipated it. "The Harrington Agreement." "Where are we?" I pressed the button. "Revised copy is on your desk, flagged in blue. There's a clause on page 9 about the arbitration jurisdiction that's going to cause problems with the Ontario regulatory timeline. I've drafted alternate language." Silence. Then, "When did you draft alternate language?" "Tuesday evening." "You had the Harrington call Wednesday morning, so..." Another pause. "Come in." I gathered the expense file, because it was easier to show him the receipt anomaly in person, and pushed through the heavy glass door. His office was all clean lines, and west-facing windows that turned the afternoon light into something that felt almost architectural. He stood at the windows in his usual way, hands loose at his sides, looking at the city like he was deciding something about it. He didn't turn when I entered. "The arbitration clause," he said. "The original language assumes disputes would be governed under British Columbia jurisdiction, but 3 of the 4 Harrington subsidiaries are incorporated in Ontario. If anything goes sideways, you'd have a venue conflict before you even got to the substance." I set the folder on the edge of his desk. "My alternate language specifies federal arbitration with a jointly selected arbitrator from the ADR Institute. It's cleaner." He turned. His eyes moved from me to the folder, then back. That assessing look, the one that wasn't unkind but also wasn't comfortable. "You anticipate problems before they exist. That's what you pay me for. Among other things. He picked up the folder. Good. I'll look at it before the afternoon call. I turned to go. There were flowers delivered to the front desk this morning. He said it without looking up from the folder. Security log shows they're addressed to you. I stopped. I wasn't expecting anything, nevertheless. He set the folder down. A bouquet, peonies. The arrangement suggests a florist on Robson, not a grocery store grab. The way he said it was careful, carefully uninflected, which, with Nathaniel Blackwell, told you considerably more than whatever he was claiming to be neutral about. I don't have anyone who would send me flowers at the office, I said. Everyone has someone, Callahan. They just don't always know it yet. I didn't know what to do with that sentence, so I left. The morning moved the way mornings at Blackwell Capital always moved, with velocity. 2 calls rescheduled, 1 investor memo requiring a full redraft because a junior analyst had included a projection figure without flagging it as speculative, and a minor crisis involving a courier who'd delivered the wrong documents to the wrong Bay Street address. I resolved it with 4 phone calls and a taxi I'd charged to petty cash without blinking. It wasn't until my lunch break that my colleague Priyanka from the floor below appeared at my desk, visibly delighted in a way that suggested she'd been holding it in since 9. Joe, the peonies. Who sent them? I have absolutely no idea. There's a card. She leaned across my desk, dropping her voice. Very mysterious. Just says, for the one who makes everything run, WW. I turned the letter over in my mind and came up empty. Do you think it's Blackwell? Priyanka asked, with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been shipping this particular situation since the day she'd watched me tell him, calmly, that his proposed meeting schedule was going to kill 3 deals and he should restructure it. And he'd stared at me for a beat and then done exactly that. No, I said more firmly than I felt. He's my employer. This is a professional environment. A professional environment in which someone just sent you $50 worth of peonies, which I'm going to ignore. The card says do. I don't know anyone with a W name who. I stopped. Someone had recently been in contact with Blackwell Capital about a potential partnership. A new name that had come across my desk twice in the last month. Warren Gale. A Vancouver-based developer trying to get in front of Nathaniel for a real estate investment opportunity. I'd fielded 2 of his assistant's calls and politely deferred both times. I didn't mention this to Priyanka. After she left, I couldn't stop thinking about the peonies. They were sitting in the lobby, apparently spectacular, cream and blush, the kind of arrangement that requires advance ordering. Deliberate, considered, the move of someone who'd wanted to make an impression and had resources to do it with. The afternoon felt heavier than it should have. Nathaniel called me in 3 times between 2 and 5 for things that could have been handled by email. I noticed this. I suspected he noticed that I'd noticed. Neither of us said anything about it. At 5:30, as I was shutting down my computer, Renata from reception materialized at my desk with an expression that suggested she was bracing for something. Mr. Blackwell asked me to arrange for the flowers to be sent upstairs. To his office. I looked at her. To his office. Yes, not to my apartment, not to the lobby. His office. He was very specific. Renata's expression was exactly as communicative as she intended it to be, which was to say she was communicating volumes while technically only describing logistics. I went upstairs. The flowers were already on the credenza behind his desk. Nathaniel was standing with his back to them, jacket off, reviewing something on his laptop, and the visual had a particular quality that I'd need years to fully interpret. A man pointedly not looking at the flowers he'd just had relocated to his personal space. You had them moved, I said from the doorway. He looked up. The lobby isn't an appropriate place for personal items. They could have been sent to my building. They're addressed to this office. His jaw tightened slightly. I have no interest in redirecting items addressed to this office to external locations until I know who sent them. You could have asked me to take them home. I could have, he said, in a tone that acknowledged the point and declined to engage with it. I didn't. Who is W? I told him about Warren Gale, watched his face do something careful and controlled that was nevertheless extremely legible. He sent 2 requests through reception for a direct meeting, I said. I've declined both, as per your standing instruction about unsolicited partnership inquiries. And yet he sent flowers to my executive's assistant. Nathaniel's voice was calm in the specific way that meant it was being held there by effort, which suggests he either doesn't understand how this firm operates, or he understands it very well and has decided to try a different approach. I thought about the card. For the one who makes everything run. He thinks I'm the access point, I said. He thinks you're useful to him. Something shifted in Nathaniel's expression. There's a difference between those two things and the compliment he's presenting it as. I want a full background search on Warren Gale by tomorrow morning. Don't respond to anything, he says. He paused, and Josephine. My first name in his voice had a different weight than my last name. It arrived with a kind of gravity he usually kept out of professional exchanges. Lock your phone tonight. If you receive any contact from an unknown number, you think this is more than someone angling for a meeting. I think I don't know yet, and I'd rather be careful. I went home with the peonies in a bag. He'd had Renata wrap them, because apparently having them was one thing. Giving them back was a different exercise in whatever complicated calculus was happening behind his composure, and I set them on my kitchen counter in a borrowed vase and sat with them for a long time. My phone buzzed, unknown number. The peonies were just an introduction. I'd love to meet you properly. I have a proposal I think you'll find interesting. Dinner Friday? I'll take care of everything. Warren and I read it twice. Then I called Nathaniel. He answered before the second ring, which was something I filed away without examining. He texted, "Forward it to me. Don't reply, don't delete it." A pause. "Are you home?" "Yes. Good, keep it that way tonight." Another pause, longer. "I'll have someone positioned outside your building by 9. Don't argue with me about this." I didn't argue. Not because I agreed that it was necessary, but because the fact that he'd anticipated the argument, and the fact that I was considering not having it, told me something about how far we'd already moved from what I'd spent 2 years calling professional. The next morning, I arrived at 7:15. Nathaniel was already at his desk, which was unusual even for him. He looked like he'd slept poorly, which was unusual for him in a different way. He was almost pathologically good at maintaining the surface. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. Not the standing briefing, sitting, which meant this was going to be a longer conversation than either of us had planned for 7:15. "Warren Gale," he said, setting down a printed file, "what do you know about real estate development in the Okanagan?" Enough to know that the regulatory environment for foreign capital partnerships changed 18 months ago. Why? Because Warren Gale's company, Gale Pacific Development, operates within a network of shell companies, 2 of which were flagged by FinTrack last year for suspicious transaction reporting. The flagging didn't result in charges, but he slid the file across. The pattern suggests a company using legitimate development projects as the surface layer of a more complicated financial operation. I looked at the file. Photographs, corporate registry printouts, a timeline of activity that overlapped, with uncomfortable specificity, with several transactions that had crossed my desk in the past 6 months as I'd processed invoices and correspondence for a real estate adjacent venture Nathaniel had been developing. "He's not trying to meet you," I said slowly. "He's trying to meet me because I processed the documentation. He's been trying to access our firm's partnership records for 3 months through official channels. I blocked all of it. He's now identified you as a softer point of entry." Nathaniel's voice was absolutely level. "He wants information about our regulatory relationships, specifically our contacts at the BC Securities Commission and our compliance protocols for cross-border investment structures." The specificity of it landed cold. "He's been watching how I work," I said. "Since October, based on what my security team put together last night. He met my eyes. He was at a conference in the fall where you represented the firm on a panel. He was in the audience. He's done his research, Josephine. You were not a coincidence." I thought about the card. For the one who makes everything run, I'd thought it was a compliment. It was a job description. He'd written down exactly what made me useful. "What do you want to do?" I asked. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant he'd already worked through several options and was deciding how much of the working to show me. "I want you to respond to his dinner invitation," he said. I looked at him. "With appropriate precautions, you'd be wired. My security lead, Hendricks, would be in the restaurant. I'd have eyes on the room." He held my gaze without looking away. "You'd let him make his pitch. We document it. and then we have what we need to take to the OSC and end his operation before it does significant damage to people who've invested in his development projects in good faith. You want me to bait him. I want to give him the opportunity to incriminate himself while you're protected." A pause. "You can say no. I'll find another way." "What's the other way?" "Less clean. More disruptive." He didn't elaborate, but he didn't need to. I'd been watching how Nathaniel Blackwell handled threats to his firm for over 2 years. He was precise and relentless, and he didn't leave loose ends, but there was always a spectrum between precise and scorched earth, and the cleaner options involved less collateral damage. "If I do this," I said, "I want full information. Everything you know. No selective briefing." "Agreed. And after this is over." I stopped. Started again. "There's something we've been not discussing for a while. I'd like to discuss it." Something moved across his face. Not surprise, exactly. More like the specific quality of someone who has been expecting a door to open and is recalibrating to the fact of it actually opening. "Agreed," he said again. Quieter this time. The preparation took 4 days. Hendricks, Nathaniel's head of security, walked me through logistics with the calm efficiency of someone who'd done this before and didn't need to make it dramatic. The wires were smaller than I expected. The signals were simple. The restaurant, a place in Yaletown that I'd actually been to before with Priyanka, which made it easier, had sightlines that Hendricks approved after what seemed like an extremely thorough visit. Nathaniel watched all of it, with his hands in his pockets and his jaw tight, interrupting only to ask additional contingency questions. On the third evening, after Hendricks and the rest of the team had cleared out, I found Nathaniel still in the conference room, standing at the window. The city was doing what Vancouver does at dusk in October, all low cloud and amber light, and he looked like he was solving something he didn't like the answer to. "You don't have to do this," he said, without turning. "I've been thinking about it all day, and I want you to know that option genuinely exists. I know. I've been building the case for why it's the best outcome. Cleanest outcome. Least damaging to the people Gail's defrauding. All of that is true." He turned. "It's also true that I'm asking you to sit across from a man who views you as a means to an end, and I want you to understand that I find that." He paused, profoundly uncomfortable. "Because it's dangerous. Because it's disrespectful." His voice shifted slightly. "You are not a means to an end, Josephine. The fact that he looked at you and saw a tool, rather than a person, says something about his judgment that I find professionally contemptible and personally." He stopped himself. "Personally what?" He crossed his arms. A defensive posture from a man who was rarely defensive, which told me more than the words he wasn't saying. "You know," I said quietly. "You could just tell me." "I could." He looked at me for a long moment. "I've been telling myself for 8 months that the appropriate time to say anything would be after you stopped working directly for me, which I was planning to address in your Year 3 review by moving you to a senior analyst track, which would have resolved the immediate reporting conflict." He paused. That timeline now seems overly conservative. 8 months. He'd been working through this for 8 months. I thought of all the small calibrations, the restructured briefing time, the way he'd never once let a junior analyst speak over me in a meeting without a quiet, devastatingly well-timed intervention, the fact that he'd had the peonies moved to his office instead of discarding them or sending them back. "Nathaniel," I said, his first name. It landed differently in the room between us. He looked at me like I'd said something significant, which I supposed I had. "I've been watching you work for 2 years," I said. "I've watched you make decisions that cost you money because they were the right call. I've watched you be a nightmare to work for in a way that's completely specific and manageable once you understand how you actually function. I've watched you call your elderly investors on their birthdays and think no one notices." I took a step toward him. "I've noticed everything, and I'm still here, so stop treating this like a liability and let me finish the job on Friday." Something in him shifted. The contained quality he wore like a second suit cracked slightly at the edges, and what was underneath was not what I'd expected. It was closer to relief than anything I'd seen on his face in 2 years. "You're infuriating," he said, "but it came out entirely wrong for criticism. I've been told." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. A small gesture, the smallest possible gesture, and then he pulled his hand back like he was reminding himself of something. Friday, he said. We finish this. And then we have a conversation that doesn't happen in a conference room. I'll hold you to that. Friday arrived with the particular crispness that October delivers in Vancouver when it decides to be beautiful about it. Hendricks had approved my outfit. A charcoal wrap dress, professional but not armored, and checked the wire twice. I took a cab to Yaletown, arrived at 7, and found Warren Gale already seated at a corner table, looking exactly like someone who'd designed their own trustworthiness. He was handsome in a calculated way, the kind of handsome that requires maintenance and then presents itself as effortless. He stood when he saw me, smiled like we'd already decided to like each other. Josephine. He said my full name, which meant he'd looked it up. Thank you for coming. I hope the peonies weren't too forward. They were unexpected. I sat. You seem to know a lot about what I like. I'm observant. He poured water without being asked, another small calculated move, and I've been impressed by how you operate. The panel in the fall. You handled a genuinely difficult question about cross-border investment transparency in a way that was both candid and remarkably precise. I thought, that's someone who actually understands the mechanics, not just the talking points. You were in the audience. I make it a point to attend. He smiled. Industry knowledge is only useful if you're constantly updating it. Speaking of which, how are things at Blackwell Capital? I've been trying to get in front of Nathaniel Blackwell for months, but the man's calendar is famously difficult. There it was, 40 seconds in. He's selective about meetings, I said. He gets a lot of requests, I'm sure he does. He's built something impressive. Warren leaned forward slightly. I have a lot of respect for what Blackwell's done with that firm, genuinely. But I sometimes wonder if he's perhaps too cautious. There are opportunities in the current market, particularly in the Okanagan Development Corridor, that require a degree of flexibility that a firm like his tends to resist. Flexibility. I kept my expression curious. Non-committal. What kind of flexibility? The regulatory environment has created some friction points for development projects that are fundamentally sound but technically complicated. The kind of friction that someone with the right relationships, at the OSC, at the municipal level, could help smooth out. Not anything improper, he added quickly. Just the kind of navigation that experienced firms are better positioned to handle. I thought of Nathaniel's summary, the Fintrack flags, the shell companies, the good faith investors who'd put their savings into Gale Pacific's development projects without knowing what the surface layer was covering. And you think Blackwell Capital is positioned to help with that navigation, I said. I think someone at Blackwell Capital might understand the value of a partnership structured correctly. His eyes held mine. The right information about how Blackwell structures its compliance protocols, not proprietary, just general practice, would help me understand whether there's genuine alignment here. It would be worth considerable compensation. Finder's fee properly documented, $50,000 to start. I set down my water glass. Warren, I said, I'd like to ask you something directly. Please. You sent me flowers at my office. You've been following my professional movement since October, and you've now offered me money for information about my employer's regulatory relationships. At what point in that sequence did you think I wouldn't notice the pattern? The temperature at the table changed. He recovered quickly. He was good at recovery, but I'd already seen the calculation replace the charm. I think you may be reading. I'm not misreading anything. I kept my voice level. I'm very good at understanding what's actually happening in a room. It's professionally necessary. I folded my napkin. I think we're done here. The restaurant's side door opened. Hendricks entered, along with two people I recognized from their credentials, an investigator from the OSC's enforcement branch, and a partner from the RCMP's Financial Crime Division, who I later learned had been building a case around Gale Pacific for the better part of a year, and had been waiting for exactly this kind of documented solicitation to move. Warren Gale's face went the specific color of someone watching their careful construction come apart. Mr. Gale. The OSC investigator's voice was professionally pleasant. We'd like to continue this conversation at our offices. You have the right to retain counsel. I walked out of the restaurant into the October night and stood on the sidewalk and let myself breathe for a moment. Hendricks materialized at my elbow with the quiet competence of someone who'd spent decades being exactly where he was needed. Clean, he said. Everything documented. You did well. My phone rang. Are you all right, Nathaniel? No preamble. I'm fine. It went exactly as planned. Better than planned. A pause. Hendricks says you cornered him beautifully before the team entered. He wasn't as subtle as he thought he was. No. Another pause, different from the first. I'm outside. I turned. Across the street, leaning against a black Audi with his hands in his coat pockets and his breath visible in the cold air, was Nathaniel Blackwell, watching me with an expression he wasn't currently bothering to manage. I crossed the street. You said you'd be close by, I said. I was, he said. I stayed close by. How long? Since you walked in. We stood on the sidewalk in the Vancouver October dark, and something settled between us that had been suspended for months. He reached out and straightened the lapel of my coat with a practicality that had absolutely nothing practical about it. You were remarkable, he said quietly. I had good preparation. You were remarkable before the preparation. You were remarkable the first week, when you corrected my contract language in a meeting with 3 senior partners and you didn't blink once. He looked at me. I noticed. I've been noticing for a long time. I know, I said. 8 months, apparently. Something like a smile. Longer than that. 8 months is when I started being honest with myself about it. We walked. It wasn't planned. We simply started moving, down the block and then along the seawall, and Vancouver did what it does at night, all reflected light on dark water, and the quiet of something large and patient. He didn't take my hand for 3 blocks, and then he did, and neither of us commented on it. I owe you a conversation, he said. You owe me several. Starting with the fact that I've been restructuring your role for 6 months in preparation for a conversation I wasn't sure I'd have the sense to actually have. The senior analyst track. It's a real position. I've already drafted the terms. The point was to resolve the reporting structure so that anything I said afterward was clean. He stopped walking, turned to face me. I don't want there to be any ambiguity about what this is, Josephine. You're not an exception to my professional ethics. You're not a complication I'm managing. I would like. He stopped, started again. I would like to take you to dinner, a real dinner, one that isn't a surveillance operation, and I'd like to see where that leads if you're willing. It was the most words I'd heard Nathaniel Blackwell use in sequence without them being about a deal. I'm willing, I said. He looked at me for a moment, then nodded. Like something had been decided, like he'd come to the end of a very long calculation and found the answer acceptable. We walked back along the seawall, and the city was cold and glittering, and I thought about 26 months of small calibrations, of coffee preferences and restructured briefing times, and a man who'd moved my flowers to his office instead of throwing them out, who'd had them moved to his office, which I was still, honestly, not entirely done thinking about. Nathaniel, I said. Yes, the peonies. Why did you have them sent to your office? A pause. I told Renata it was for security reasons, he said. I remember what you told Renata. Another pause. Longer. Because I didn't want them in the lobby, he said, where anyone could see them, and I didn't want them sent home, where I couldn't. He kept walking, eyes forward, the back of his neck just barely visible above his collar. That's not a defensible position professionally. I'm aware. I thought about everything I'd filed away in 2 years. The birthday calls, the meeting interventions, the moment he'd said, I know you haven't without any hesitation when I'd told him I hadn't betrayed his trust, because he'd already decided that was true. It's defensible personally, I said. He looked at me sideways. Is that your professional assessment? It's my personal one. The almost smile again, the one I'd spent 26 months cataloging. We had dinner the following Saturday. Actual dinner. A small Italian place in Kitsilano that he'd apparently researched with the same thoroughness he applied to everything. Because the handmade pasta was extraordinary, and the owner knew his name, and I spent the evening learning that Nathaniel Blackwell, outside of a professional context, was funnier than I'd anticipated and considerably more relaxed, though the relaxation was its own kind of careful, like he was remembering how to do it. I told him about my family in Halifax. He told me about his grandmother in Edinburgh, who was the reason he read actual physical books and was inexplicably good at shortbread. We disagreed about whether the Canucks had a realistic shot at anything meaningful, and agreed about almost everything else, which was either a very good sign or a sign that we'd been calibrating to each other For so long, we'd lost the ability to have the disagreement. I thought it was probably the first one. The Warren Gale case moved quickly after that. The OSC enforcement action was thorough. The documentation from the restaurant, combined with what the Financial Crime Division had already assembled, was more than sufficient. There were investors who recovered losses. There were others who didn't fully, and that was a harder thing to sit with. But Nathaniel's legal team worked with the regulatory bodies to ensure the recovery process was as structured and fair as it could be made to be. Gale Pacific Development was dissolved. Warren Gale's name left the conversation, and I stopped thinking about peonies in a fraught way and started thinking about them the way I had before, as flowers I liked, in spring, that smelled like something beginning. 3 months later, I moved from the 31st floor to a different role, senior investment analyst, with a team of 2 and a portfolio of projects that required exactly the kind of structural attention I was good at. My desk was no longer outside Nathaniel's office, which was logistically correct, and personally something I was still adjusting to. He adjusted to it by finding reasons to walk past my new office approximately 4 times a day, which his assistant, a composed young man named Elliot, who had lasted 6 months already and seemed likely to continue, clearly noticed and carefully did not comment on. We weren't public about it, not from secrecy, but from a mutual preference for letting things be real before they were observed. Priyanka figured it out in November, said nothing to anyone, and simply started texting me with slightly different energy that I appreciated. In December, during a particularly brutal week of year-end reporting, he arrived at my office at 7 p.m., with takeout from the Vietnamese place on Granville. That he'd learned was my preference, during a very ordinary conversation 4 months earlier, that I hadn't realized he was memorizing. He set it on my desk, didn't say anything, sat down in the chair across from me and opened his own container, and read something on his phone while I finished the paragraph I was working on, and the silence had a quality I'd never quite experienced before. The kind that's comfortable the way something long wanted is comfortable when it finally arrives. "You remembered the lemongrass one," I said eventually. "You mentioned you'd switched from the vermicelli." He didn't look up from his phone. "In September, you'd had it twice in the same week. 2 months later, he'd remembered a throwaway food preference for 2 months. "You," I said, "are a profoundly strange man." He looked up. "Yes, I mean that as a compliment, I know." The corner of his mouth moved. "You're not particularly subtle, Josephine, when you're complimenting me. You get a specific expression." "What expression?" "Like you're making a decision, and you've already made it, but you're giving yourself the opportunity to change your mind and then not changing it." I thought about that. It was unfortunately accurate. "I'm not changing my mind," I said. "I know." He looked at me across the takeout containers and the year-end reports and the December dark outside my window. "Neither am I." That was the thing about Nathaniel Blackwell I was learning. He made decisions the way he did everything. Methodically, with full information, and then without reservation. He'd decided about me, and he wasn't revising it. And there was something in that steadiness that felt, after 2 years of a job that required me to be ready for anything, like the specific relief of something I could count on. Spring came late, the way it does in Vancouver, and then all at once, cherry blossoms overnight, and the mountains finally clear of cloud. I walked to work through Yaletown, on the mornings when the weather permitted, which Nathaniel knew because he'd started meeting me for coffee at a place on Homer Street that was on neither of our direct routes, but happened to be exactly halfway between. We didn't discuss the future in explicit terms for a long time. We didn't need to. It was present in the coffee routine, and the takeout, and the fact that I had a drawer in his kitchen, and he had a key to my building, and in the way that his grandmother called from Edinburgh on Sunday evenings and had, somewhere in the last 2 months, started asking to speak to me as well. "She likes you," he said, after one of these calls, with the expression of a man who found this both thoroughly unsurprising and quietly significant. "She has excellent taste," I said. "She does." He was quiet for a moment. "She said you remind her of someone." "Who?" "Herself, apparently." He looked at me with that look I'd stopped trying to fully decode and started simply receiving. "At 28, before she'd done everything she eventually did. She said, you have the same quality of knowing what you think without needing anyone to confirm it." I thought about the first time I'd corrected a clause in one of his contracts in a meeting with 3 senior partners, and the particular feeling of being absolutely certain I was right in saying so anyway. "That's a good thing to be," I said. "It is," he agreed. "It's also, for the record, the specific thing that made me realize I was in serious trouble, professionally speaking, approximately 4 days into your tenure." 4 days, I stared at him. "You reorganized my entire filing protocol without being asked," he said. "You sent me a 3-line email explaining the new system and why it was more efficient. You were 26 years old, and you had been working for me for 4 days, and you emailed your CEO a better idea without hedging it once. You implemented it. Immediately." He looked at me. "That should have told me something." "It told me something," I said. "That you cared more about whether a system worked than about who suggested it. And I thought, I can work for this person for a long time." He reached across the table and took my hand, which he still did with a specific deliberateness, like he was choosing it, like it was always a choice he was making. "You were right," he said, "about the long time." The cherry blossoms came down in one long April weekend, carpeting the sidewalks in something that felt extravagant and temporary and exactly correct. I walked through them on a Sunday morning with Nathaniel, and Vancouver did what it occasionally remembers to do in spring. It was stunning, simply and without apology, mountains and water and light, and I thought about peonies delivered to a lobby and a man who couldn't throw them out, and all the strange, sideways paths that arrive at exactly where you meant to be. He stopped walking, turned to face me with his hands in his pockets, and that look I'd learned to read, the one that meant he was arriving at the end of a long internal calculation. "I have something I want to ask you," he said. "Ask it," I said. "It requires more than a 3-line email," he said, which was, and I would tell Priyanka this later, almost verbatim, the most Nathaniel Blackwell thing he'd ever said to me, and I loved him for it completely. He asked. I said yes. We stood on the sidewalk in the cherry blossom confetti of an April morning, and he looked at me with something that I still don't quite have the language for, relief and decision, and a particular tenderness that he'd always had somewhere in him, but had spent years not knowing what to do with. I knew what to do with it. I'd known for a while. We walked home through the blossoms, unhurried, the city around us doing its ordinary Sunday morning things, and I thought about 26 months of careful attention and all the forms it takes when someone doesn't have the words yet, but has all the evidence. Coffee orders memorized, schedules restructured, flowers that couldn't be thrown away because throwing them away would have meant something he wasn't ready to say. He'd said it now. I had too. That was enough to build everything else from.